The dust cloud on the horizon looked like salvation to Winifred Davies as she stood in the doorway of her ramshackle homestead, one hand shielding her eyes from the merciless Montana sun of 1878. She hadn't eaten in 2 days, and the growling in her stomach had become a familiar companion, like the silence of the prairie that stretched endlessly around her small patch of failing farmland. Winifred Winnie, to the few folks who knew her, had come west with dreams as vast as the territory itself. At 23, she'd left behind the crowded streets of Boston following her parents' death from influenza, armed with nothing but determination and her father's pocket watch. The promise of free land under the Homesteader Act had called to her like a siren, whispering of independence and opportunity. Now, a year later, that promise felt as hollow as her cupboards. The approaching rider materialized slowly, a tall figure atop a magnificent chestnut stallion. Winnie tucked a strand of auburn hair behind her ear, suddenly conscious of her appearance, faded calico dress hanging loose on her frame, hands rough from failed attempts at coaxing crops from the unyielding soil. As the rider drew closer, Winnie could make out a strong jaw, shadowed with stubble beneath the brim of a well-worn Stetson. His shoulders were broad, his posture easy in the saddle like a man born to ride. "Madam," he called out, tipping his hat as he reined his horse to a stop several yards from her porch. "Victor Madigan's the name. Looking for water for my horse if you can spare it." Winnie hesitated. Water was one of the few things she had in abundance, thanks to the creek that cut through the back of her property. "I've got water," she replied, her voice stronger than she felt. "Your horse is welcome to it." Victor Madigan dismounted with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to long days in the saddle. Up close, she could see his eyes were the color of a summer sky, startling in their clarity against his sun-darkened skin. He wasn't young, perhaps 30 or 35, but he moved with the vitality of a man in his prime. "Much obliged." His gaze swept over the homestead, taking in the untended fields, the weathered boards of the small house, the absence of livestock. Something in his expression shifted, but he kept his observations to himself. "Been a dry season." "That it has," Winnie agreed, leading him toward the back where a simple wooden trough caught water from the creek. She walked carefully, fighting the lightheadedness that had been her constant companion these past days. Victor led his horse to water, murmuring soft words to the animal as it drank. "You out here alone, madam?" "I am," Winnie lifted her chin, defiant. "Homesteading my own claim." A respectful nod. "Brave undertaking." "Not brave, necessary." She hadn't meant to sound so sharp, but hunger had shortened her temper. "I'm sorry, Mr. Madigan. It's been a difficult season." "Call me Victor." He studied her face, his eyes lingering on the hollows beneath her cheekbones, the tightness around her mouth. "When's the last time you ate, madam?" Shame burned hot in Winnie's chest. She turned away, unwilling to admit her desperate circumstances to this stranger. "I manage. I've got jerky and hardtack in my saddlebags. Not much of a meal, but it's something. I don't need charity." The words tumbled out before she could stop them. Victor Madigan's expression didn't change. "Not offering charity, offering to share my provisions with someone who'd do the same if situations were reversed." The simple dignity in his words broke through her pride. Winnie nodded once, a quick, jerky movement. They sat on her porch steps sharing his meager provisions as the afternoon sun began its slow descent. Victor ate little, claiming he'd had a large breakfast in the last town. Winnie knew it for the lie it was, but accepted his kindness without further protest. "What brings you out this way?" she asked, savoring the salt of the jerky, the way it awakened her senses. "Working my way north. Got a job waiting at a ranch near Helena." "You're a cowhand?" A slight smile touched his lips. "Among other things. Started as a drover, worked my way up to foreman on a spread in Wyoming. Now I'm heading to take over management of the Circle B." Winnie's eyebrows rose. "The Circle B? I've heard it's one of the largest operations in the territory." "So they say." He shrugged, downplaying what they both knew was a prestigious position. "What about you? What brought you to this particular patch of Montana?" She gestured to the land around them. "It was free. And mine." Or it will be after 5 years if I can make it productive. Victor nodded, understanding the weight of the Homestead Act's requirements. Tough to do alone. I'm discovering that, Winnie admitted. The admission cost her. But there was something about Victor Madigan that invited honesty. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across her land, Victor stood. I should make a few more miles before nightfall. Disappointment pricked at Winnie, surprising her with its intensity. This man was a stranger, yet his presence had briefly lifted the crushing solitude of her existence. Thank you for the meal, she said formally. Victor hesitated, looking toward the horizon, then back at her homestead. Ms. Davies, I don't mean to overstep, but I noticed your fields haven't been plowed properly. The soil here needs different handling than back east. I've discovered that as well, Winnie said dryly. Unfortunately, discovering a problem and solving it are different matters. I could help, he offered. Stay a day or two, show you some techniques that might work better. The Circle B isn't expecting me for another week. Wariness flickered across Winnie's face. A man offering to stay at a woman's homestead invited gossip at best, danger at worst. Yet something in Victor's straightforward manner reassured her. I have a small barn, she said finally. You could sleep there. The smile that spread across his face transformed his features, revealing a dimple in his right cheek. I've slept in worse places, Ms. Davies. Winifred, she corrected him. Or Winnie. Winnie, he repeated, the name sounding different in his deep voice. I'll fetch my bedroll from Rusty here, then see about getting some firewood cut before dark. You look like you could use a hot meal. As Victor unsaddled his horse and settled the animal in her small corral, Winnie found herself watching the efficient movements of his hands, the way his shoulders flexed under his worn cotton shirt. It had been so long since anyone had offered her help without expecting something in return. It made her uneasy, this unexpected kindness. True to his word, Victor spent the remaining daylight hours cutting and stacking firewood beside her cabin. Winnie used some of it to heat water, washing her face and hands in preparation for their evening meal. She changed into her second dress, nearly as worn as the first, but at least clean, and pinned her hair more carefully. When she stepped outside, Victor had a fire going in the pit she'd dug her first week on the homestead. From his saddlebags he'd produced coffee, beans, salt pork, and even a small pouch of sugar. Where did you get all this? Winnie asked, amazed at the bounty. A man learns to pack essentials when traveling long distances, Victor replied, setting a small pot of beans to cook. Coffee's the most important. Can't function without it. Winnie laughed, the sound startling her. How long had it been since she'd laughed? I used to feel the same way. Had to give it up when my supplies ran out 2 months ago. Victor looked genuinely distressed by this information. No coffee for 2 months? That's uncivilized. They ate under the vast canopy of stars that only the Montana sky could provide. Talking of small things, the unseasonable warmth, the quality of the beans, the temperament of his horse. Victor didn't press her for details about her situation, and Winnie found herself grateful for his discretion. Later, as he prepared to retire to the barn, Victor paused. If you're agreeable, I'll look at your plow tomorrow, see what adjustments might help. The soil here is different from what you might be used to. I'd appreciate that, Winnie said, standing in her doorway. Thank you, Victor. He tipped his hat, a silhouette against the night sky. Good night, Winnie. She watched him stride toward the barn, his footsteps sure, even in the darkness. Only when the barn door closed behind him did she enter her own small house, securing the door with a wooden bar, a habit she hadn't broken despite the seeming safety of her visitor. Inside, Winnie lit a small lamp and moved to her cupboard. She opened it, revealing the barren shelves that had reduced her to tears just that morning. The emptiness mocked her, a physical representation of her failure to thrive in this harsh land. But tonight, with a full stomach and the promise of help tomorrow, the empty cupboard didn't seem quite so devastating. Winnie touched the wooden shelves, imagining them laden with preserves, flour, coffee, all the necessities that had run out as her crops failed and her funds dwindled. One day at a time, she whispered to herself, an affirmation that had gotten her through the darkest moments of the past year. Just one day at a time. With that, she extinguished the lamp and lay down on her narrow bed, listening to the night sounds of the prairie, and for the first time in months, fell asleep without the gnawing pain of hunger. Morning arrived with the scent of coffee wafting through the cracks in her cabin walls. Winnie dressed quickly, splashing water on her face from the basin and pinning her hair in a simple knot. The night's rest had restored some color to her cheeks, some brightness to her green eyes. Outside, Victor had the fire going again, a pot of coffee bubbling at its edge. He stood as she approached, that same easy smile lighting his features. "Hope I didn't wake you," he said. "Thought we might need fortification before tackling that plow." Winnie accepted the tin cup he offered, inhaling the rich aroma. "This alone is worth having you stay." A chuckle rumbled from his chest. "Sets a low bar for my usefulness, but I'll take it." They shared a simple breakfast of hardtack softened in coffee. Then Victor asked to see her farming implements. Winnie led him to the lean-to behind the cabin where her meager collection of tools rested: a plow that had been old when she purchased it, a hoe with a cracked handle, a rusted rake. Victor examined the plow, running his hands along its blade, testing the attachments. "This needs work," he said frankly, "but I think I can make some adjustments. Do you have a forge?" Winnie shook her head. "Nearest blacksmith is in Liberty Gulch, 15 miles east." "That's where I came through yesterday," Victor nodded. "Tell you what, I'll ride back, get what we need. With the right modifications, this might serve you better." "I can't ask you to do that," Winnie protested. "You've already been too kind." Victor's blue eyes held hers steadily. "You didn't ask. I offered. There's a difference." Before she could argue further, he continued. "Besides, I saw your root cellar on the way to the barn last night. Looks like you've got potatoes and turnips started. With a properly working plow, you could expand, maybe plant corn or wheat next season. Land like this takes time to tame." His assessment was accurate. Winnie had managed to coax a small crop of root vegetables from the earth, but her attempts at grains had failed miserably. "The soil's different here," she admitted, "nothing like Massachusetts." "That's because this was grassland for centuries. Breaking the prairie takes special techniques." He set the plow down. "I'll head to Liberty Gulch now. Be back by afternoon. While I'm gone, perhaps you could show me your property boundaries, get a better sense of what we're working with." The "we" wasn't lost on Winnie. This stranger had somehow decided her problems were now his to solve, at least temporarily. Pride warred with practicality inside her. She needed the help desperately, but accepting it felt like admitting defeat. Victor seemed to read her thoughts. "My father always said there's no shame in accepting a helping hand. The shame comes when you refuse to offer one when you're able." Winnie's resistance crumbled. "Thank you," she said simply. He nodded, as if the matter were settled. "I'll saddle up Rusty, back before you know it." True to his word, Victor returned in the early afternoon, his saddlebags laden with supplies from Liberty Gulch. Beyond the blacksmithing materials, he'd brought flour, sugar, coffee, salt, beans, bacon, and even a small bottle of molasses. "What's all this?" Winnie asked, staring at the bounty spread across her small table. "Necessities," Victor replied, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to bring a virtual stranger a month's worth of provisions. "Ran into the general store owner, fellow named Hiram. Says he remembers you from when you first arrived." Winnie nodded, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. "I haven't been to town in 3 months. Couldn't afford to buy anything, so it seemed pointless." Victor's eyes softened. "He asked about you, said to tell you he's holding mail for you." Hope flared in Winnie's chest. "Mail? From whom?" "Didn't say, just that it arrived a few weeks back." Winnie sank onto one of her 2 chairs. Who would write to her? She had no family left, and her few friends in Boston had wished her well, but promised nothing in the way of correspondence. The isolation of her existence crashed over her anew. Victor busied himself organizing the supplies, giving her a moment to compose herself. "I'll put the coffee and sugar in your cupboard, if that's all right." She nodded, watching as he opened the empty cabinet and began carefully arranging the packages on its shelves. The sight of food, actual food, where there had been nothing but dust and disappointment, brought unexpected tears to her eyes. Victor pretended not to notice her emotion, continuing to stock the cupboard until its shelves were filled with more provisions than Winnie had seen in months. When he finished, he had to push firmly to get the door to close properly. "There," he said with satisfaction. "That should hold you for a while." Winnie wiped at her eyes, embarrassed by her tears but unable to stop them. "I can't accept all this. It's too much." "Consider it payment for letting me work your land," Victor replied. "I've been too long in the saddle. Could use the exercise before settling into management at Circle B." It was a transparent excuse, they both knew it, but Winnie seized on it gratefully. "If you insist on payment, then at least let me cook for you while you're here." A smile broke across his face. "Now that's a fair trade. Been living on my own cooking too long. A man can only take so much burned bacon before he starts questioning his life choices." The afternoon passed with Victor working on her plow, heating metal in a makeshift forge he constructed from stones and the bellows he'd brought from town. Winnie baked biscuits in her small stove, the familiar motions returning to her hands, as if she hadn't been subsisting on foraged greens and occasional game for weeks. By evening, Victor had modified the plow with a different cutting angle and reinforced the weakest joints. "It's not perfect," he told her as they sat down to a simple but satisfying meal of beans, bacon, and fresh biscuits, "but it should cut the soil better, get deeper into the ground." "How did you learn all this?" Winnie asked, savoring the salt of the bacon, the way the beans had softened and taken on flavor during the slow cooking. Victor's expression grew distant. "My father had a small farm in Missouri. Nothing fancy, but enough to feed us and have some left to sell. He was always tinkering, improving his tools. Said a farmer who doesn't adapt doesn't survive." "Wise man." "He was." A shadow crossed Victor's face. "Lost the farm during the war. Raiders burned everything, took what they couldn't destroy. He never recovered from it." Winnie's heart ached for the pain evident in his voice. "I'm sorry." Victor shrugged, visibly setting aside the memories. "Life goes on. I was 16, old enough to find work, headed west, found I had a way with horses. Been working ranches ever since. And now you'll be running one." Pride flickered across his features. "Circle B's owner's getting on in years. No sons, just a daughter who married a banker in Helena. He needs someone to manage the day-to-day operations." "It sounds like a good opportunity." "It is." Victor hesitated. "Though I've always thought I might have my own place someday. Something smaller than Circle B, but mine." The yearning in his voice resonated with Winnie. It was the same desire that had driven her west, the need to claim something as her own, to build rather than merely survive. "That's why I'm here," she said softly. "To have something that belongs to me, that I built with my own hands." Their eyes met across the table, understanding passing between them without words. For a moment, Winnie felt less alone than she had in months, perhaps years. The moment stretched, then broke as Victor stood to clear their plates. "We should start early tomorrow. The weather looks good for plowing." Winnie nodded, collecting herself. "I'll be ready." As they prepared for another night, Victor again refusing her offer of the cabin floor in favor of the barn, Winnie felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Not quite hope, but perhaps its precursor. Possibility. The next morning dawned clear and cool, perfect weather for the heavy work ahead. Victor had hitched Rusty to the modified plow, explaining that her small draft horse, though sturdy, lacked the necessary strength after months of poor grazing. "I'll take the first shift," Victor said, positioning himself behind the plow. "Watch how I handle it, then you can try." Winnie observed as he guided the horse and plow across her field, the blade cutting deeper into the soil than she'd ever managed. Victor moved with confidence, his strong hands adjusting pressure when needed, his voice steady as he directed Rusty. After an hour, he stopped to rest the horse and offered Winnie a turn. She took her position behind the plow, and Victor stood close, his hands occasionally covering hers to demonstrate the proper technique. "Like this," he said, his breath warm against her ear as he guided her grip. "Feel how the soil changes? You adjust here?" Winnie was acutely aware of his proximity, the solid presence of him at her back. It had been so long since she'd been touched by another person, even in so practical a manner. The sensation was both unsettling and oddly comforting. They worked through the morning, taking turns with the plow, stopping occasionally to water the horse and themselves. By midday, they'd turned over more soil than Winnie had managed in a week of solitary effort. "This might actually work," she said, surveying the dark earth exposed by their labor. Victor nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. "Land's good. Just needs the right handling." They continued until late afternoon, when Victor insisted they stop. "Don't want to overwork Rusty," he explained, "and there's something else I want to show you before sundown." Curious, Winnie followed him to a different section of her property, a low-lying area near the creek where the soil stayed damp even during dry spells. "This," Victor said, crouching to examine the ground, "would be perfect for a kitchen garden, close enough to the house for easy tending, naturally irrigated by the creek." Winnie knelt beside him, touching the rich, dark soil. "I hadn't thought of using this section. I was focused on the larger fields." "Big harvests are important," Victor agreed, "but a steady supply of vegetables close at hand can make the difference between comfort and hardship." He outlined a plan for a small but productive garden lettuce, carrots, peas, tomatoes, potatoes, crops that would provide sustenance through most of the year if properly tended and preserved. "I have seeds," Winnie said, excitement building as she envisioned the possibility. "I brought them from Boston but wasn't sure when or where to plant them." Victor smiled, that dimple appearing in his cheek. "Tomorrow we'll start your garden." They returned to the cabin as dusk settled over the prairie, both pleasantly exhausted from the day's labor. Winnie cooked a simple stew from the provisions Victor had brought, adding wild onions she'd gathered near the creek. As they ate, Victor asked about her life before Montana. Winnie found herself sharing stories of her childhood in Boston, her father's work as a bookkeeper, her mother's garden behind their modest home. "They both died within a month of each other," she said, the familiar grief muted now by time and distance. "Influenza swept through our neighborhood. I nursed them both, somehow never caught it myself." "That must have been difficult," Victor said quietly. Winnie nodded. "Afterward, there was nothing keeping me there. The house belonged to the bank, really. I had some savings, my father's watch and my mother's wedding ring. Enough to get me here and buy basic supplies." "Brave undertaking," Victor repeated his assessment from their first meeting. "Or foolish," Winnie said with a small smile. "Some days I'm not sure which." "Bravery and foolishness often look the same at the outset," Victor observed. "It's the results that tell the tale." "And what about you?" Winnie asked. "What made you choose this life?" Victor considered the question, absently turning his coffee cup in his hands. "After the war, after losing the farm, there wasn't much back east for me. Tried working in St. Louis for a while, lumberyard, dock work, but I felt confined. Out here, there's space to breathe, room to become whoever you want to be without the weight of the past pressing down." Winnie understood completely. That's it exactly. The possibility of reinvention. Their eyes met again, recognition sparking between them. This shared understanding, this common yearning, created a connection that transcended their brief acquaintance. Later, as Victor prepared to head to the barn, he paused in the doorway. "I'll need to leave the day after tomorrow. Circle B is expecting me." Disappointment flooded Winnie, stronger than she had any right to feel. "Of course," she said, keeping her voice steady. "You've already done more than enough. Tomorrow we'll finish the plowing and set up your garden," he promised, "and I'd like to repair that leak in your roof before I go." "You noticed that?" Winnie asked, surprised. Victor's eyes crinkled. "Hard to miss the bucket in the corner. Besides, a good roof is as important as a full cupboard." The mention of her cupboard, now bursting with provisions, brought a flush of gratitude and embarrassment to Winnie's cheeks. "I don't know how to thank you for everything." "No thanks needed," Victor replied. "Just promise you'll ride into Liberty Gulch soon. Collect your mail. Get to know your neighbors. Montana's harsh, but its people look out for each other. You don't have to do this alone." His words resonated deeply. Hadn't that been her greatest struggle this past year? Not just the physical hardships, but the crushing solitude, the sense that she was utterly alone in her fight to survive. "I promise," she said softly. Victor nodded, satisfied. "Good night, Winnie." "Good night, Victor." She watched him cross the yard to the barn, his silhouette outlined against the darkening sky. Only when he disappeared inside did she close her door, already dreading the moment when he would ride away. The next day passed in a whirlwind of activity. They finished plowing the main field, then turned their attention to creating the kitchen garden. Victor showed Winnie how to build raised beds using stones from the creek, explaining how they would retain heat and extend the growing season. Together, they planted her precious seeds, some in the newly prepared garden, others in small containers to start indoors until the threat of frost passed. Victor worked steadily on the roof during the hottest part of the afternoon, replacing damaged shingles and ceiling leaks with materials he'd brought from town. By evening, Winnie's homestead had been transformed. The plowed field, the nascent garden, the repaired roof, all tangible evidence of what could be accomplished with knowledge, hard work, and an extra pair of hands. As they sat by the fire pit sharing their final meal together, Winnie found herself searching for words to express her gratitude. What Victor had done went beyond mere assistance. He had given her hope, restored her belief that she might actually succeed in this wild country. "I want you to have this," she said finally, removing her father's pocket watch from the small pouch she wore at her waist. "It was my father's. It's the most valuable thing I own." Victor shook his head, gently closing her fingers back around the timepiece. "I can't accept that, Winnie. It's your family's legacy." "You've given me so much," she insisted. "I have to give you something in return." His hand remained wrapped around hers, warm and steady. "If you want to repay me, do it by succeeding here. Make this place thrive. That would be worth more than any watch." Winnie felt tears threatening again. "I don't know if I can do this alone." Victor's blue eyes reflected the firelight as he studied her face. "You're stronger than you realize. And you don't have to be completely alone. Liberty Gulch isn't far. There are people there who would help if asked." "Like you did?" A smile tugged at his lips. "I'm particularly susceptible to determined women standing in doorways looking like they might blow away in a strong wind." Despite herself, Winnie laughed. "Is that how I appeared to you?" "That, and like someone who wasn't about to give up, no matter how hard things got." His expression grew serious. "That kind of determination is rare, Winnie. It's what the West demands, but few actually possess it." His words warmed her more than any fire could. "Thank you for seeing that in me. Sometimes I forget it's there." "I won't forget," Victor said softly. The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken possibilities. Winnie was acutely aware of his hand still covering hers, the way his eyes seemed to memorize her features in the flickering light. Finally, Victor released her hand and stood. "Dawn comes early. We should get some rest." Winnie nodded, suddenly shy. "Yes, of course." They extinguished the fire and walked together to the cabin. At the door, Victor tipped his hat. "Good night, Winnie." "Good night, Victor." She watched him cross to the barn, a now familiar ritual that would end tomorrow when he rode away. The thought left an ache in her chest that surprised her with its intensity. How had this man, this stranger, become so important to her in just 3 days? Winnie entered her cabin, moving through the familiar space that somehow felt different now. Victor's presence had changed it, filled it with possibilities she hadn't dared imagine before his arrival. She opened her cupboard, still amazed by its transformation from empty to abundant. Running her fingers over the packages of flour, sugar, coffee necessities that had become luxuries in her months of deprivation, Winnie made a silent promise to herself. She would not squander this chance. She would make her homestead thrive, just as Victor believed she could. Morning arrived with a somber gray sky, threatening rain-fitting weather for farewells, Winnie thought as she dressed. She prepared a hearty breakfast of biscuits, bacon, and coffee, determined to send Victor off with a full stomach at least. He appeared at her door just as she was setting the table, his hair damp from washing at the pump. "Something smells amazing," he said appreciatively. Nothing special, Winnie replied. Just wanted to thank you properly before you leave. They ate companionably, discussing last-minute advice for her garden and fields. Victor suggested she hire the blacksmith's son from Liberty Gulch to help with the harvest when the time came. He's a good worker, according to his father. Strong back, honest character, worth considering. Winnie nodded, though the thought of anyone but Victor helping with her harvest left her oddly disappointed. Too soon, breakfast was finished, and the time for departure had arrived. Victor saddled Rusty while Winnie packed in provisions for the journey: biscuits, jerky, a small pouch of coffee. Circle B is about 2 days' ride from here, he told her as he secured his saddlebags, north and west near the foothills. Winnie nodded, committing the direction to memory, though she knew visiting would be impossible any time soon. Her place was here, working the land he had helped prepare. Victor mounted Rusty, looking down at Winnie from the saddle. For a moment, he seemed about to say something significant, then simply tipped his hat instead. Take care of yourself, Winnie Davies. And you, Victor Madigan. She attempted a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Thank you for everything. He nodded once, then turned his horse toward the north trail. Winnie stood in her doorway, watching until horse and rider disappeared over the horizon, wondering why the ache in her chest felt so disproportionate to their brief acquaintance. The rain began shortly after Victor's departure, a steady spring shower that would help her newly planted garden. Winnie busied herself indoors, organizing the provisions, mending clothes, writing a list of tasks based on Victor's suggestions. As evening approached, the rain intensified, becoming a downpour that drummed against her newly repaired roof. Winnie lit a lamp and sat at her small table, listening to the storm and fighting an unexpected wave of loneliness. 3 days. Victor Madigan had been in her life for just 3 days, yet his absence left a void that seemed to expand with each passing hour. It was ridiculous, Winnie told herself. She had lived alone for months before his arrival. She would continue to do so now that he was gone. Yet as she prepared for bed, Winnie found herself opening her cupboard once more, staring at the bounty with intangible evidence that Victor had been real, that he had cared enough to ensure she wouldn't go hungry again. Foolish woman, she murmured to herself, closing the cupboard door firmly. He was just being kind. But as she lay in her narrow bed, listening to the rain, Winnie couldn't help wondering if Victor was thinking of her too, somewhere on the trail to his new life at Circle B. The days following Victor's departure fell into a rhythm dictated by the needs of Winnie's homestead. She tended her garden, carefully following his instructions. She rode into Liberty Gulch, collected her mail a letter from a childhood friend who had married and moved to California, and introduced herself to the townspeople Victor had mentioned. Hiram at the general store greeted her warmly, extending credit when she explained her situation. The blacksmith, a burly man named Ferguson, offered his son's services for the harvest, just as Victor had suggested. The local doctor's wife invited Winnie to join the women's quilting circle that met monthly. Slowly, Winnie began to understand what Victor had meant about not having to be completely alone. The community of Liberty Gulch, though small and scattered, offered connection and support she hadn't known to seek. Spring gave way to summer, and Winnie's garden flourished under her attentive care. The field Victor had helped plow showed promising signs of growth, the seedlings emerging in neat rows where once there had been only stubborn earth. Each small success felt like a message to Victor, wherever he was. See? I'm doing it, just like you believed I could. In late July, as Winnie was harvesting the first of her tomatoes, a rider appeared on the horizon. Her heart leapt before she could control it, but as the figure drew closer, she saw it wasn't Victor. Instead, a young man of perhaps 20 approached, removing his hat as he reached her yard. "Ms. Davies," he called, "I'm Thomas Ferguson, blacksmith's son. Pa said you might need help with your harvest come fall." Winnie greeted him, offering water for his horse and discussing terms for harvest assistance. Thomas was polite and clearly capable, but as he rode away with a promise to return in September, Winnie felt a pang of disappointment that she immediately chided herself for. What had she expected? That Victor would abandon his position at Circle B to return to her struggling homestead? The very idea was absurd. August brought scorching heat and infrequent rain. Winnie worked from dawn until the worst of the day's heat forced her indoors, then resumed in the evening hours. Her garden continued to produce, providing fresh vegetables that she ate with gratitude, remembering the days of near starvation before Victor's arrival. She began preserving the excess canning tomatoes, drying beans, storing potatoes in the root cellar. The cupboard that had once stood empty now contained jars of her own produce alongside the provisions Victor had brought. Each time she opened it, Winnie felt a quiet satisfaction tinged with memories of the man who had made it possible. As promised, Thomas Ferguson arrived in September to help with the harvest. Together they brought in Winnie's modest crop, not bountiful by established farmers' standards, but miraculous to her after the previous year's failure. "You've done well for a first proper harvest," Thomas told her as they loaded the last of the corn onto his wagon for the trip to the mill. "Especially working mostly alone," Winnie smiled, pride warming her chest. "I had good advice. With Thomas's help, she sold part of her harvest in Liberty Gulch, keeping enough to see her through the winter with a small surplus. The proceeds weren't substantial, but they allowed her to purchase necessities and even a few small luxuries, a new winter coat, proper boots, a book of poetry to read during the long evenings ahead." As autumn painted the landscape in gold and crimson, Winnie felt a sense of accomplishment that sustained her through the increasingly shorter days. She had survived a full cycle of seasons on her homestead. She had planted, tended, and harvested. She had connected with her neighbors, established herself as part of the community. Yet despite these achievements, despite the growing security of her situation, Winnie found herself watching the northern horizon whenever she stepped outside, hoping for a glimpse of a rider on a chestnut horse. October brought the first frost, crystallizing the grass and painting delicate patterns on her windows each morning. Winnie had prepared well, stocking firewood, securing the cabin against drafts, ensuring the roof would withstand the coming snows. On the first truly cold evening, as she sat by her stove mending a shirt, a knock at her door startled her so badly she pricked her finger with the needle. Visitors were rare, especially after dark. Winnie set aside her sewing and approached the door cautiously. "Who's there?" "A friend," came the reply, the voice instantly recognizable despite the months since she'd heard it last. Winnie's hands trembled as she lifted the bar and opened the door to find Victor Madigan standing on her porch, hat in hand, his blue eyes reflecting the lamplight from within. "Victor," she breathed, his name escaping her lips before she could form a more composed greeting. A smile spread across his face, revealing that familiar dimple. "Winnie." They stood regarding each other for a long moment before Winnie recovered herself. "Come in, it's freezing out there." Victor stepped inside, bringing with him the scent of horses, leather, and the crisp autumn air. He looked much as she remembered, perhaps more weathered from months of outdoor work, his shoulders somehow broader in his heavy coat. "Your place looks good," he said, glancing around the cabin that Winnie had improved with small touches over the months, curtains sewn from fabric purchased with her harvest money, a rag rug by the bed, shelves Victor himself had built now holding books and personal items. "Thank you," Winnie replied, still processing the reality of his presence in her home after so many months of absence. "What brings you this way?" "Circle B must be busy preparing for winter." Victor set his hat on the table, his movements deliberate. "It is. But I needed to see how you fared with the harvest." "You rode 2 days just to check on my crops?" Winnie asked, disbelief coloring her tone. A smile tugged at his lips. "Among other reasons." Hope fluttered in Winnie's chest, but she tamped it down. "The harvest was good, not abundant, but better than I'd dared hope. Thomas Ferguson helped, as you suggested." Victor nodded, seeming pleased. "I knew you'd manage it. Did you get a fair price in Liberty Gulch?" "Fair enough," Winnie confirmed, moving to stoke the fire in her stove. "Would you like coffee or something to eat? I have stew left from supper." "Coffee would be welcome," Victor said, "and I wouldn't turn down stew if it's no trouble." Winnie busied herself with these simple tasks, grateful for the chance to compose herself. Victor was here, in her cabin, after months of absence. The reality of it seemed dreamlike. as if she might turn around to find he'd never been there at all. But when she placed a steaming bowl of stew and a cup of coffee before him, Victor was solid and real, his presence filling her small home in a way she'd almost forgotten. "How is Circle B?" she asked as he ate, needing to fill the silence with safe topics. "Prosperous," Victor replied. "Owners pleased with the changes I've implemented. We've expanded the herd, improved the breeding stock. It's good work." "I'm glad," Winnie said sincerely. "It sounds like the opportunity you were hoping for." Victor nodded, his eyes never leaving her face. "In many ways, it is." They talked of practical matters as he finished his meal, the condition of her livestock, improved thanks to better feed and care, the preparations for winter well underway, the community connections she'd established in Liberty Gulch, growing stronger each month. Only when the stew was gone and the coffee cups emptied did Victor broach the true purpose of his visit. "Winnie," he began, his deep voice serious, "I didn't come just to check on your harvest." Her heart quickened its pace. "No." Victor stood, moving to her cupboard and opening it to reveal shelves now filled with her preserves, sacks of flour and sugar, coffee beans and dried herbs hanging from hooks she'd installed. "When I first met you," he said, studying the contents, "you were weeping over empty shelves. Now look at this. You've done exactly what I knew you could do." Winnie joined him by the cupboard, suddenly shy. "Thanks to you. Without your help, I'm not sure I would have survived another winter here." Victor turned to face her, close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the faint scar along his jawline she hadn't noticed before. "You would have found a way. That's who you are, Winnie Davies, a survivor. But there's a difference between surviving and living." The intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. "What are you saying, Victor?" "I'm saying I've spent 6 months running one of the largest cattle operations in the territory. I've increased profits, expanded holdings, earned the respect of every hand on the payroll." He paused, his expression softening. "And not a day has passed that I haven't thought about a stubborn, courageous woman standing in the doorway of a struggling homestead, determined to make something of nothing." Winnie's heart hammered against her ribs. "You thought of me?" "Constantly," Victor admitted, his voice lowering. "I told myself it was concern for your welfare. Professional interest in whether my agricultural advice proved sound." "But it wasn't just that," Winnie said, finding courage in his honesty. "No." Victor's hand rose to cup her cheek, his touch gentle as if she might shatter beneath his fingers. "It wasn't just that at all." Winnie leaned into his touch, 6 months of longing crystallizing into this single perfect moment. "I thought of you too. Every day." The confession hung in the air between them, fragile and momentous. Then Victor lowered his head, bridging the final distance to press his lips to hers in a kiss that began tender but quickly deepened with months of unspoken yearning. Winnie's arms circled his neck, drawing him closer as his hands moved to her waist. The solid warmth of him, the gentle insistence of his mouth on hers, awakened sensations she'd never experienced, a hunger different from but no less urgent than the physical deprivation she'd endured before his first arrival. When they finally parted, breathless and flushed, Victor rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since the second day I was here," he confessed. Winnie smiled, joy bubbling through her veins like champagne. "Why didn't you?" "Because I was leaving," Victor replied. "Because you deserved better than a man passing through." "And now?" Winnie asked, daring to voice the question that mattered most. Victor straightened, taking both her hands in his. "Now I'm here to ask if you'd consider a partnership." "Partnership?" The word was not what she'd expected. "I've resigned from Circle B," Victor explained, "effective after the first snowfall when the new foreman arrives from Wyoming." Surprise widened Winnie's eyes. "But why? You said it was everything you wanted." Victor shook his head. "I thought it was. Then I met you, saw what you were building here, something that truly belonged to you. It reminded me of what I really wanted, not to manage another man's empire, but to build something of my own." Hope bloomed in Winnie's chest, but she needed clarity. "What are you proposing exactly, Victor Madigan?" A smile touched his lips, affection warming his blue eyes. I'm proposing that we combine our skills and resources, your land, my experience. Together, we could make this place not just survive, but thrive. A proper ranch and farm. As business partners? Winnie asked, needing to hear the full truth of his intentions. Victor's hands tightened on hers. As partners in every sense of the word, Winnie. As husband and wife, if you'll have me. The words hung in the air, beautiful and terrifying in their simplicity. 6 months ago, Winnie had been a desperate woman facing starvation and failure. Now she stood before a man offering her not just security, but partnership. Not just assistance, but love. This is rather sudden, she said, though her heart had already made its decision. Victor's expression grew serious. Is it? I've thought of little else since I left here in spring. I tried to convince myself it was too soon, that we barely knew each other. But the truth is, Winnie, I recognized something in you from the first moment, a spirit that matches my own. A determination I respect above all other qualities. Winnie understood completely. Hadn't she felt the same recognition, the same inexplicable connection from their earliest conversations? What if I'm not ready to marry? She asked, testing his commitment. What if I need time? Then I'll wait, Victor replied without hesitation. I'll build a cabin on the far side of your property, help you with the heavy work, teach you what I know about ranching, prove myself worthy of your consideration. His willingness to respect her boundaries, to earn her trust rather than demand it, confirmed everything Winnie had come to believe about Victor Madigan's character. And if I don't need time? She asked softly. If I already know my answer? Hope blazed in Victor's eyes, but he controlled it, waiting for her to continue. Winnie stepped closer, placing her hands on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. I would be honored to partner with you, Victor Madigan, in every sense of the word. Joy transformed his features, making him appear younger, unburdened. You're sure? It hasn't been that long since we met. I've survived starvation, isolation, and the harshest winter of my life, Winnie replied with a smile. I know my own mind, Victor. I've thought of you every day since you left. I've compared every man I've met to you and found them all wanting. Victor gathered her in his arms, lifting her off her feet in his enthusiasm. When he set her down, his expression had grown serious again, though his eyes still shone with happiness. I don't have much to offer materially, he said. My savings, my horses, my skills. But I promise you this, Winifred Davies, I will work every day to build something worthy of your courage, your determination. Something that belongs to both of us. Winnie reached up to touch his face, tracing the line of his jaw with her fingertips. That's all I've ever wanted. Something of my own, someone to share it with. Their second kiss was deeper than the first, a promise exchanged without words. When they parted, Victor glanced toward the door. I should get my bedroll from Rusty. It's getting late. You're not sleeping in the barn tonight, Winnie said decisively. Not when you've ridden 2 days to propose marriage. A slow smile spread across Victor's face. No, Winnie confirmed. The proprieties of Boston don't apply on the Montana frontier, not between two people who've already decided to spend their lives together. Victor's arms tightened around her waist. Are you sure, Winnie? I don't want to rush you into anything. In answer, Winnie reached up and began unbuttoning his shirt, her fingers steady despite the novelty of such boldness. I've been alone too long, Victor. I don't want to wait another night to begin our life together. His breath caught as understanding dawned in his eyes. Winnie, he murmured, her name a prayer on his lips as he bent to kiss her again. That night, in the narrow bed that had held only Winnie's solitary form for so many months, they discovered each other fully, learning the contours of passion with gentle, reverent hands. Victor's tenderness matched his strength, his patience, a counterpoint to the urgency of their mutual desire. Afterward, as they lay tangled together beneath the quilt Winnie had received from the women's circle in Liberty Gulch, Victor shared his plans for their homestead, expanding the fields, adding cattle, building a proper barn, and eventually a larger house. We'll start small, he said, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. "A few head of quality stock. Build from there. In 5 years, this could be one of the most productive operations in the county." Winnie smiled against his chest, content in a way she'd never imagined possible a year ago. "I like the sound of that. Our own place, built with our own hands." "Just like you always wanted," Victor murmured, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Better than I imagined," Winnie corrected him, "because now I won't be doing it alone." They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, the autumn wind singing around the eaves of the cabin that had witnessed Winnie's solitary struggle and would now shelter their shared dream. The following spring found the homestead transformed. Victor had spent the winter implementing improvements. A new barn stood where the lean-to had been. Corrals extended behind it for the small herd of cattle he'd purchased with his savings. The main field had been expanded and a second garden plot prepared beside the first. Most significantly, construction had begun on a proper house adjacent to Winnie's original cabin. It would have 4 rooms, Victor explained as they worked together, setting the foundation: a parlor, a kitchen with an attached dining area, and 2 bedrooms. "2?" Winnie had asked, raising an eyebrow. Victor had smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "1 for us, 1 for the children I hope we'll have." They had married in Liberty Gulch just before Christmas, a simple ceremony witnessed by the friends Winnie had made in town and the handful of ranch hands Victor had befriended during his time at Circle B. Hiram from the general store had hosted the celebration in the rooms above his shop, and Dr. Thompson's wife had organized the ladies of the quilting circle to prepare a feast worthy of the occasion. Now, as April sunshine warmed the newly turned earth, Winnie stood in the doorway of their cabin, still her primary domain, until the new house was completed, and watched Victor working with the 2 horses he'd trained to pull their plow. His movements were sure, his instructions to the animals clear and calm. This was a man who understood partnership in all its forms, who knew how to work with rather than against the natural order of things. As if sensing her observation, Victor looked up, catching her eye across the yard. His smile still made her heart skip, even after months of marriage, months of waking beside him and falling asleep in his arms. He secured the plow and crossed to where she stood, removing his hat as he approached. "Taking a break?" he asked, noting the cup of coffee in her hand. "Bringing you some," Winnie replied, offering the steaming cup. "You've been at it since dawn." Victor accepted the coffee gratefully, taking a long sip before setting the cup on the porch rail and pulling Winnie into his arms. "Best decision I ever made," he murmured against her hair. "Coming back here, asking you to be my wife." Winnie leaned into his embrace, breathing in the scent of him, earth and leather, and the soap she made herself. "I think about it sometimes," she admitted, "how different everything would be if you hadn't stopped that day, if you just continued on to Circle B." Victor's arms tightened around her. "I couldn't have ridden past, not with you standing there looking like a strong wind might carry you away." Winnie laughed, the sound carrying across their expanding homestead. "I was rather pitiful, wasn't I?" "Never pitiful," Victor corrected, tilting her chin up to meet his gaze. "Determined, stubborn, beautiful." A blush still heated Winnie's cheeks at such direct compliments, even after months of hearing them. "I had nothing to offer you then, an empty cupboard, a failing farm." "You had everything to offer," Victor countered. "Courage, vision, a partnership worth more than any management position." Their lips met in a kiss that quickly deepened, the familiar passion between them undiminished by daily proximity. Only the distant whinny of one of the plow horses separated them, Victor reluctantly pulling away. "Duty calls," he said with a rueful smile, "but we'll continue this discussion later." Winnie watched him return to the field, admiring the strong lines of his back, the confident set of his shoulders. How had she gotten so fortunate? To find not just survival in this harsh land, but love, partnership, and the promise of a future brighter than any she dared imagine when she first claimed her homestead. Moving back inside, Winnie opened their cupboard, expanded now to accommodate their growing provisions. The shelves Victor had once struggled to fill now bulged with the bounty of their combined efforts. Preserves from last summer's garden, flour ground from their own wheat, coffee and sugar purchased with the proceeds from their first cattle sale. Stroking the smooth wood of the cupboard door, Winnie remembered how she had wept over its emptiness just a year ago, how that moment of despair had coincided with Victor's arrival on the horizon. Now, as she prepared ingredients for the bread they would share at supper, Winnie sent a silent prayer of gratitude into the universe, for the cupboard that could barely close, for the land that had tested but not defeated her, for the man who had seen her value when she herself had begun to doubt it, and most of all, for the life they were building, together, a life as abundant as the provisions that now sustained them through each season, each challenge, each joy yet to come.